Hello and welcome to the Punkling Podcast. I'm Jared and I'm here with my co-host.
Rolando.
We're starting this podcast as just an open forum to discuss anything nerdy or just relevant at the time. Games, news, trading cards, we'll probably end up talking about it here. Today, we're looking to have a bit of a discussion about world building and Dungeons and Dragons, specifically the perspectives of two forever DMs and how we handle, the worlds we've come up with, the worlds we've created, and how players interact with them, and just how we approach the different tons of different situations that come up. So if you want a little bit of insight into what your dungeon master is thinking and why they keep on face palming when you decide to do something, this is gonna hopefully shed a little light on that. So,
Happens so
to
often.
start, it happens a little too often. Actually, to start us off, we can talk about those facepalm moments. So I DM for two separate games. One is a game that I DM for just my me and my wife. We talk about we not talk about wow we play through. We have our own world. We have all this established stuff, and then I have a game that I run with a couple of my friends, and I feel like I want to say chaos, but I don't want to disservice the word chaos. It's pretty gnarly. Some of the things that go on. We have a mostly lawful, not lawful. Wow, not lawful. Stupid. We have a mostly chaotic good party. Like the standard D&D party, and then we have one chaotic evil character, who is it's what it says on the tin. He is as chaotic evil as you can get. Where there are some times where he'll just be like, "Yeah, I don't mind. That's like whatever." And there's other times where he's like threatening to kill a kid, and you're like, "Dude, stop, please." It's bad. But I guess that's kind of where I want to start. Is how do you handle, specifically for you, Rolando? How do you handle these vast differences in players that you always see crop up in D&D games? Because everybody's like, "Oh, I could probably DM for a chaotic evil player," until they have a chaotic evil player.
Real quick before answering that question, just so we kind of get a scope of, I've been DMing for uh, 5-6 years now. I've DM'd multiple campaigns, world built about 3 different settings at this point. My most recent setting kind of encompasses all of them. I've DM'd for very various different like levels of players, being it from very new who need to learn how to use the D20 and how it works and how do you do the math and all that, to players who are min maxing and playing towards a specific circumstance, whether it be that being combat or in role play. I've had a wide range of players play for me. Again, anybody from I have 2 sentences for my backstory and I sent you a dissertation for mine. So, just so you guys kind of get a grip of where I'm coming from. The chaotic evil players is very interesting to me, and I find it more often than not. It can be very fun when it's done properly, but alignment over the years I've grown to like a lot less. And I understand like why it's there. It's like a guiding on decisions you would make, right? Or a way you would act. Um, but
Mm-hmm.
I've grown to kind of learn that it seems to me a more accurate representation of what alignment is how other people view you, not how you act towards other
Mm-hmm.
people. So what you do to you is not inherently evil or chaotic or lawful. But what other people view you as doing is those things, if that makes sense. So, like, obviously, threatening a child at knife point is evil no matter who you ask, right? Even some bad guys would be like, all right, fam, that's a kid. What are you doing?
How fucked up is fucked up. That's
Yeah.
fucked up.
Yeah. Um, but, like, the way other people view you is way more conducive to what alignment is than I believe it should be. I don't even think, now that I'm trying to think in the current campaign I'm DMing, I don't even think we use alignment. Like it's on the sheet, right? And people pick things, but it fluctuates so often that odds are that what they have on their sheet from when they created the characters in the first place isn't actually there anymore. But in terms of like dealing with that player, I think it's kind of teaching them that like the motivations behind what the player is doing. A lot of the times they don't normally understand what what the character actually wants, because if you think about it, right, so like let's say you're an evil necromancer and you have some reason, we won't even get into having how you get them to like meld in with the party well, because that's its own beast. But let's say
That's a can of worms.
yeah, let's say they found whatever reason to follow the party around for whatever selfish reason they can find, or whatever selfless reason, maybe it's a long lost friend is with them, whatever. But you're with the party for a reason, and they go. Excuse me. So they're with the party, and maybe I totally lost my train of thought. Jesus Christ.
I think you were talking about how, possibly like a necromancer, a pretty typical chaotic evil build.
Oh right. Right.
Where how that would meld in, how that would flow, and how that would be seen.
So somebody with an ultimate goal. Let's say this necromancer wants to amass an infinite army and rule the world with his zombies, right? Let's say that is his ultimate goal. Like at level 20, at the end of his life, that is what he wants. Or maybe lichdom. Let's say that happens a lot. Lichdom. Mm-hmm. That character in and of itself, more often than not, logically, would feign good all the way into the point where they could turn the corner and then show everybody who they actually are. And I think understanding that evil in and of itself is deception. It's making people think what your reasons are genuine and good, and then turning around behind the scenes and turning them in your favor without calling attention to yourself. Because if the entire time you're threatening children all the way down the road, people are going to know you're bad, and eventually someone's going to be like, that guy's a psychopath, he's going to be a problem, we're just going to deal with him right now, before you even get to your ultimate goal. I don't know if that answers the question, but
yeah, no, that's about right. The most successful, evil characters are the ones that look like, the road is paved with good intentions, or however that the saying goes. Exactly. I mean, what Emperor Palpatine is probably the best example of a evil character who looked like he was just the most well-intentioned person. He was, oh no, I want to protect the security of the people and the Republic, and oh no, look at that, I actually wanted to start an empire all along, and you guys just gave me all the power to do so.
100%. And I think that's usually the couple times, because it doesn't happen often, and usually it's when they have a specific idea in mind, or maybe an infatuation with an idea, is when you sit down and kind of explain to them how things work. Because D&D, for people who haven't played before, can have a very like Skyrim feel to a lot of people. They're like used to like the Skyrim thing where they could just do whatever they want, and they're decidedly OP, and they just kind of like run around and nobody can tell them what or where, and like there is an amount of logic that goes into D&D, like real life interactions, and how people would respond to certain things like actually make sense. Like so it's kind of hard to like, yes, you can do whatever you want, or try. You can try to do whatever you want, but that does not mean it's without consequence.
Yeah, I think that's the big differentiating factor between D&D and a lot of video game RPGs, is video game RPGs can't account for every action you'll take, so they usually don't. Like in Skyrim, we have, the funny meme of, when you pick up like a bucket and put it on the shopkeeper's head and steal everything, because mechanically in the game their sight line is impaired, so they can't see you stealing. If in D&D you were like, yo, I'm just gonna take a bucket and put it on this guy's head, he would take it off his head and say, "What the hell are you doing? Get out of my shop."
100%,
and
100%.
and so yeah, a lot of the those perceptions of, oh, it's like a video game RPG, but just with my friends at a table, is really kind of misguided. And I think yeah, with RPGs and games being probably, at least at this point, more popular than tabletop RPGs, which is where they more or less originated from.
Mm-hmm.
I think that sort of skews that idea where they're like, oh yeah, it has RPG in the name, so it probably plays just like a video game. I can do what I want. But the thing that makes D&D so different and so much better in a lot of ways is the dynamic world and the dynamic reactions that the world can have on your actions. They're like how it's pretty much impossible for us to make the video game with a million endings, where everyone's like, oh, Telltale games and Life is Strange type games, they only have like 3-4 different possible out
Mm-hmm.
differences, even though
Mm-hmm.
you have like a option every minute or two. um because yeah, they're on a budget. They have to do animation for every different decision you make. They have to do modeling, and they have to
Mm-hmm.
get the voice lines, and voice actors are expensive, and then there's a bunch of other things. They have to keep all these teams coordinated. It turns into a big mess quickly. But D&D, where it's a kind of not guided tour, but it's like a guided experience with the DM presenting you this world, and living in it. You get a choice to really impact and feel the impact of things that you've chosen to do long after they have happened. Because instead of being like a game where it's like, well, we didn't really program for that, the DM can be like, yeah, you guys, when you freed this, I don't know, this artifact, you actually released this lich into the world. Good job. And like, oh, we didn't know that was going to happen. And yeah, well, should have thought about that. So
My
there's a
favorite.
lot of
Go ahead. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
oh no, that was basically just reiterating the point. There's a lot more outcomes that happen in D&D, and yeah, when you push the world will push back.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. 100%. And it pushes back in ways that you wouldn't necessarily expect, right? Like there's
Hmm.
a pod. There's a D&D podcast. I can't remember what it is that I listened to a while back, but the entire premise of it is decades after the heroes of this world, essentially, decades after the heroes of this world went off and they saved the world and they're off doing adventure things on a different continent now. This new band of heroes goes to visit these towns, and I believe it's
Mm.
like they go to visit these towns essentially, and they come to find out that all the things that the heroes did to save people caused other things to cascade into chaos. Like for example, the first town they meet up in, there was a dragon. They killed the dragon, but what that party didn't know, they killed the dragon and moved on, right? What that party didn't know is
Mhm.
when they killed the dragon, that dragon was holding off uh, the orc tribes that were living in the nearby mountains, and so now like the orcs were like coming down and wreaking havoc on the same town that the dragon was wreaking havoc on, and like while they only had to pay the dragon like their money and their jewels and their shiny things, these orcs are like taking no prisoners, and they're like eating people and this and that and the other thing. So it's like the aftermath of what you do, even when it's a good thing, there is still a consequence to that good thing. So it was a very interesting thing.
D&D is
Um,
a really good place where you can explore the quote unquote happily ever after, where there rarely ever is. And like all things, no good deed goes unpunished. That's that example is kind of similar to the world that I've been crafting. I've been pretty much keeping all my campaigns in one world, but more or less same premise. The original heroes save the world. If your first campaign isn't saving the world, what are you doing? um, but the original heroes, they save the world. Everything's all good. They win, quote unquote. They little do they know that because they've disrupted a natural cycle, the world is supposed to end. If you are wondering where this whole idea came from, go listen to Parthenax from Skyrim talk about the idea of kalpas. And so the world is supposed to end so the next world can begin, but prolonging this world is now going to lead to some unnatural occurrences. And the a group rises up out of this, as almost retaliation against the people who saved the world, because you guys just defied nature. The world was supposed to end. Now look at all the issues we have to deal with because you stopped the world from reaching its natural end. And they want to, turn around and bring about the end of the world. Granted, it's not for purely, natural reasons. They think there's a way they can, preserve themselves through the end of the world. Bunch of crazy, fun, convoluted stuff, but ultimately, yeah, it's that same idea where the heroes go, "We won," quote unquote, because we did the good thing, and it's like, well, yeah, I guess you did, but here's what else is happening now because of your good thing. Hope you like it.
Yeah. Um, and I think that's a pretty good kind of segue into like what is in terms of like world building and your world specifically. We can get like a small overview. I know there's a lot in world building, so it's hard to stay small. But a small overview of like what you and your world like. What is it called? What is it about?
All right, yeah. So the world that I run, that I've been crafting over 2 years, is called Valyun. It's kind of an adapted version of the Forgotten Realms, where I've just been slowly taking, Forgotten Realms stuff, changing things, changing landscape, stuff, changing names, changing locations, and just slowly adapting it so I can, kind of get it away from five from 5e's worlds into making it its own place. But it's a extremely high magic world. A lot of people talk about low magic worlds where magic is rare. If you can find magic, it's very regulated, and the practitioners of it are shunned. Low magic worlds. Then
Mm-hmm.
high magic worlds are where magic is just kind of like, if you don't know what magic is, you're looked at like, somebody who doesn't know what the Beatles is, for example. Like, magic is everywhere. Magic is touching every aspect of life. And so yeah, Valyun is a little bit of kind of a fanboy project because one of the big, features of this place is that portals and rifts to every other universe you could think of have opened up across this place, which has allowed for the magic, the technology, the people, everything to seep in. So, worlds like Runeterra from League, or Skyrim, Maple Story's world, all of it, kind of meshing in. Whoa, didn't mean to punch my microphone. Um, all of these things kind of flooding in through these rifts and these portals. Even our modern world is connected to it in some ways. And the technology, and while not many people in these worlds you can even find these portals because they're very, very, obscured, kind of that idea of like the Feywild, it's right there
Mm-hmm.
but it's super obscured, so you can't actually really
Mm-hmm.
glimpse into it. But when you can, if you are, magically attuned enough, or you're just lucky or unlucky enough to, stumble yourself into one of these portals, um you'll, find themselves into a whole nother world. And so it takes a whole bunch of lore and world building from a whole bunch of other different places, and kind of makes it its own. But pretty much the whole world initially, for the first stretch of campaign, was completely sectioned off. It was its own self-contained world. And then as the campaign went on and after the world was saved, I just have called it the Sundering, which I'm sure there's a million and one places that have called it the
that's
Sundering. I want to come up with a way
that's so
cooler name
funny.
than that.
My catastrophic event is literally called the Sundering. That's hilarious.
My guy. Please. I'm so
That's so
tired.
funny. That's so funny.
um so after this, this magical sundering, a whole bunch of, things started happening. So um children were starting to be born. It started happening a little before the end of the world because of all these different places that the heroes had to travel to. They had to go to these other worlds to, to be able to get their pieces of their MacGuffin to stop the end of the world. Big long explanation, not even going to get started going into. But the this world is super homebrewed, out the wazoo. The original heroes are level 50, which, as you might know about 5e, the max level is 20. Most of them are gods or have usurped some kind of godhood. It's got a little crazy there at the end, but if you know me, you know that I love crazy. I love fantasy taken to the extreme. I love taking the mundane and turning it into the absurd, and that
Definitely.
was kind of the whole point of this. Like the for the final boss battle, I decided that, you know what, instead of it being a really difficult thing, because they had a really difficult second to last boss, um instead of doing another kind of long slog, uh instead we are going to make it so that they have a what's the word I'm looking for, just a kind of a great big you know hoorah sort of final fight. And they did um s- uh 69 septensexagentillion damage to defeat the final boss. I pretty much made it so where every attack they didn't add damage, it multiplied the damage done previously. And they had two dirt turns to pump out as much damage as they possibly could do. And then they ended up doing, it was like 69 septensexagentillion damage. Don't look up how many zeros that is. It's a lot of zeros.
It sounds
um,
like a lot of math.
it was pretty much just every time they did it, just times enter, times enter, times enter. And so it was bombastic. It was fun. It looked cool, and the end of the world was destroyed by our gunslinger monk punching it in the face so hard that it shattered. So yeah, uh, um, that was kind of how that whole thing played out. But it's really been kind of an opportunity for me to explore kind of expanded lore of these game worlds and other worlds that I love a whole bunch. And my wife has really enjoyed it because it's been kind of it's been a really good mix of combat, adventure. Like I I jokingly call it a romantic comedy sometimes, because there's a lot of romance and character interactions and families. And specifically, the one thing that I really really thank my wife for is she contributed the best, most interesting character to this world in Jonathan Lightstrider. He was her first character. She loves the idea of these really mundane names for heroes, and it kind of has the same energy as the name like Luke Skywalker. And I even made the joke. I
Right.
was like, ah, yes, four-letter name, uh, for four-letter name, a source of light and a form of movement. John Light Strider, Luke Skywalker.
That's funny. That's funny.
And so it he was this really mundane, like he was a carpenter he was a carpenter and a farmer who only had a bow because his family had to fight boars off of the farm. He wasn't trained in any special school. He had no real major interest in adventuring. And after getting drawn into the adventure, by being asked to help with a few things around a town, he got sucked into the adventure of a lifetime. And instead of being like going with the flow, she really played him to a T, where he resisted. He did not want to keep adventuring past a certain point. And there were times where he would just want to give up. He would be so defeated, but he kept on picking up his bow and kept on going out there because he looked at the world and all the people he'd grown to meet and loved. And you know he didn't want to be doing this, but he had to do this. And the idea of a hero that doesn't think they're a hero because I literally just want to own a farm. I'm not doing this for anything else. I just want to own a farm, and I don't want it to get blown up in like 5 years. So if
I'm
you ever
just a commoner. Yeah.
yeah, and so
Leave
he never lost touch with that. Sorry.
No, he's just like sitting there like, leave me alone. I just want to live.
That was quite literally his thing. Is just like, leave me alone. I actually really liked, how the thread went all the way through to the very, very end of the campaign. It was very symbolic and really funny, but also very symbolic. Where at the end of the campaign, right after that finishing punch had been dealt to the end of the world, and it was quiet, and everybody was watching the shockwave ripple around, the world from watching one of these creatures called observers. It's once again convoluted lore. These extra dimensional creatures that run the world being defeated, and it went quiet, and everybody was like waiting and getting ready to burst out into a cheer of triumph and success. He looked at the wizard, who she was kind of the coordinator of all of these extra dimensional, all of these time traveling shenanigans, and looked at her and took his bow and chucked it at her face, went into the house, slammed the door. And that was it. He was done. And he was so fed up with all of the adventuring, with all of the pain, with the just continual ramping of power of the things that they had to encounter. Where it was, he could handle a couple goblins and bandits, but when they were having to fight things that were trying to transcend and usurp godhood, it got to be a bit much for him. So yeah, that's kind of a basic rundown of the world. And so yes, in future campaigns I've been dialing it back a little bit, because one of the fun things about homebrew is you can do basically whatever you want. One of the hardest things about homebrew is that you don't exactly always have control in the balance of anything you want.
Yeah, the balance is incredibly difficult.
Yeah, and so there were some fights that I got that really good, skin of their teeth wins, and other times where they like two-turn the boss, where the boss is like, oh yeah, I've got legendary actions, I got this, I got all kinds of stuff, and they're like, damn, that's crazy. Anyways, does a 51 to hit? So yeah, stuff like that. But what about you, Rolando? I'm actually kind of curious. So you said you worked on 3 worlds. If you feel like you could, discuss all 3 of them, that would be fantastic. But if you just want to discuss your favorite one or the one you're working on now, that'd be cool too.
So, so the most recent one is actually an amalgamation of all 3. So essentially, the first world I kind of put together right at the beginning of the time period that will not be named over the past couple of years. No, at the beginning of the pandemic, right? We started playing D&D online with friends and stuff. And then that world was essentially, I've always had this weird infatuation. I don't know if it's weird, but I think it's weird. With like ancient Greek and Roman times, just that sort of time period is very interesting to me. The worship of various different gods, and how that plays into everyday society and such. Like it's just interesting to me. The relationships that get formed, and how gods are just buff humans essentially, and they're still petty and they still interact, and they're like, oh, you looked at me funny, I'm gonna have sex with your wife. Like, Zeus, we're looking at you. But so the first world was essentially set in a ancient Greek time, Greek Roman, because it's like Colosseum type of space. And the essential concept to that is there's the entire world itself was in one of the there was a point in time, scientifically speaking, where all the continents on the Earth were like one giant landmass, right?
Well, yeah, Pangea.
Yeah, I couldn't remember that word. Pangea. And Pangea is what this world started looking like. So you can like effectively walk to the entire other side of the quote unquote world. And it was just this giant island. But it was ancient Greek times, but it was all connected. So it was this interesting amalgamation of cultures, and essentially what the premise for that campaign is rather short-lived, because it was my first campaign, and it's a little harder to kind of get to like an overarching theme. But the party in and of itself, consisting of four, I believe it was four players at that point. The idea was they won a tournament. They won an amount of just like a Coliseum death battle thing. They won an amount of like reputation, and they became known as like heroes, and people would call them to do certain things. At a certain point in time, there's this guild that popped up, who seemed, or not guild. It presented itself as a guild. It was really a cult. This cult kind of, its only standing thing that they did is there was this black plague-like oozing substance that would be coming out of people. Turns out they were the cult that worshipped and was trying to summon Jublex himself. Jublex is a demon lord within the Forgotten Realms. So they went through their adventure, and it was relatively simple. It was super simplified, super... there's a cult, you fight the cult, they summon him anyway, you fight the bad guy, you kill the bad guy. So it took us, as D&D does, it took us a little bit longer to get there. But there was this a counter to the cult was a guild. I can't remember the name of the guild at this point, but that becomes relevant later. The second world that I made was a kind of offshoot of it. It's a world that I use for one-shots a lot, and it's essentially about 1,000 years into the future of the original world, where Jublex has been killed. The original party members, I love immortalizing the players who, or the characters who help in the world building, so a lot of times I just kind of carry them over and their legacy, and it's cool to see, like, you don't always have the same players playing in every campaign, but it's always cool to see that look on their face when they go up to a monument and they're like, you describe their previous character and whatever deeds they did before they passed, or how they passed, or what they did in order to get to this point in time. And it's always cool to see that face just kind of light up in a very interesting...
That's me.
Yeah, like, hey, I did that. That's a decision I made. Or like having them see the look of horror on their face when they realize that like a decision they made forever ago still impacts the world to this day, and it may not be a positive thing. But they still have bearing on the world, and it makes this very interesting dynamic where like they want to do things, and they want to do things in character, but they're curious about how it's going to impact things, and maybe in the next campaign or in the next coming years. So it's very interesting. But the second world is set a little bit thereafter, and it was more a political intrigue kind of situation. So it was dealing with corruption and governments, but still within the same world. But essentially,
Why'd you just say the same word twice? Ha ha ha.
Ha ha ha. Got him.
Anyways.
But yeah, that's so funny. But yeah, essentially the second campaign is the overarching concept of that campaign. Again, that's very simple, but it was a kind of like a grittier campaign where it was about investigation and figuring out where the corruption was coming from within the forms of power that be, and figuring out that the person at the beginning that comes off as being the bad guy is not the bad guy, and it's this weird... it turned into being so like the president, I guess, is the best way to describe this position. It's the president or king of the realm is very... It comes off as being very corrupt and doing weird things, and he comes off as crazy and loony even. I guess that's the same thing, but whatever. But that world itself is... excuse me while I itch my eyeball. Sorry. But
I itch my eyeball specifically.
Yeah. But yeah, so he comes off as being like a bad person, but turns out he's, the entire time he's been very, like, he's been heating off and doing certain favors for people in order to keep the peace for the common folk.
He's been choosing
the
the lesser
party,
of two evils, more or less.
100%. Yeah,
so to say?
yeah,
Okay.
exactly. and like the party gets up to the point where they're positive it's him, and they know that he's the one doing these things, and they're right, he's the one doing these things, and they go over to confront him, knife to throat. He fought them back because if they figure it out, then it might, they might tell people, and then the secret's out, and then he's not in power anymore, and then if he's not in power anymore, who knows what's going to happen. So he tries to fight them off. He's down to 1 HP. He's screaming uncle. He's asking for mercy with a knife to his throat, and everyone's like, why would you do this? And he goes into this really, really long monologue. And it's one of the only times that my players have actually allowed me to finish a monologue. Most of the time, they just kill the character.
Instead of surprise attack, I roll for a surprise attack.
Yeah, exactly. That is the most frustrating thing ever.
I've heard that before of like, oh yes, cool villain monologue, and I shoot him in the head. My guy.
But he goes on and he essentially explains where he's coming from and why he's doing what he's doing, and it's a very surreal moment when they realize, like, yeah, he's not a good guy, but he's not a bad guy. But he's essentially protecting hundreds of thousands of innocent people under his rule, and they're faced with the decision of what we do. Like,
would I have been able to make this decision in his shoes, sort of thing?
Yeah, 100%. He chose his own fall from grace in order for the greater good, like you were saying. And so that was a really interesting campaign. We never actually did a wrap up for that one. That one was cool. Eventually, at some point, we might. But the most recent one is my favorite. This is more where I took more of a page out of Mr. Hardy's Jared of Jared's book, and I kind of took media from.
Sorry.
Yeah.
One thing real quick. When you were talking about your last campaign with the king, saying I was lesser of two evils, there's two things that come to mind. I think it was Fable 3, where the ending, you realize the king has been kind of an ass, and you're like, oh my gosh, we got to go kill this guy. And when you get to his palace, he goes, all right, fine, fuck it, you're in charge now. And you're like, wait, why are you making me in charge? He says, by the way, there's an evil, all-encroaching darkness that's on the horizon. You've got about a couple years to figure it out. Bye. And you're like, oh, that's why he had high taxes and was like taking food from presidents, because he was like, it was either that or we lose to the darkness. And now you have to make the same decisions. And so that gave me that kind of vibe. Or the the Lysandra from League of Legends. Her whole backstory was recently rewritten. At least I think it was recently, and it's essentially the Void wants to come in through the Freljord, and she was like, while she wasn't necessarily good, she's trying every excuse and everything she can in the book to be like, yeah, it'll be ready in a couple more minutes. And she's just keeping them at bay, trying to do as little of their bidding as possible, while still keeping them sated so they don't just be like, screw it, we're going to invade. And so she's been kind of doing
100%.
that sort of balance of how do I stay not a horribly bad guy that everybody turns against me, but how do I also make sure that the Void doesn't get upset with me? And so, choosing the lesser of two evils.
100%. It's the whole concept of the ends justify the means, right? Mm-hmm. Like, I'm doing this because at the end of the day, if I succeed in what I am doing, it's going to be okay. Not because it's okay right now, but because when we're done and all is said and we talk about this when everything's over, it'll be fine.
It's also got the same...
Go ahead.
Oh, sorry. Okay, it has the same energy as Emperor Palpatine, who he's a really good villain, very well written. There's a lot of kind of expanded universe theories, if you've heard of the Yuzan Vong. They're this sort of like this intergalactic species that pretty much hops from galaxy to galaxy and just consumes all life, and kind of like the Flood almost, give or take. And they are just these warlike, destructive, horrific, and almost impossible to beat foes. And a lot of people suspected that the reason that Palpatine seemed like he was almost intentionally trying to make everybody hate him in the Empire is because he was doing everything he could to be ready to stop the Yuzan Vong invasion. Like, the reason that they built a second Death Star after the first one got destroyed was because they were like, we have to be able to destroy these Yuzon Vong world ships, which were essentially, ships almost the size of planets that were made of living organic material. It's crazy, expanded universe stuff. But a lot of
Mm-hmm.
people speculate that that was the goal of the empires. Palpatine was terrified of the Yuzong Vong and wanted to have all hands on deck to be able to fight them back when they showed up, because they always show up. They always find a way. They, I think, tried to invade the Star Wars galaxy once and they got repelled, but they were much smaller then. Been a couple thousand years, and they're going to come back and they're going to be pretty pissed about it. So yeah, sorry about that. I
Yeah.
just that
No,
also
no, you're
came to
good.
my
You're
mind
good.
is
Uh,
being bad to be
It
good.
yeah, it's yeah, like yeah, it's a very it like yeah, like you said, Palpatine is a very well written villain, because there's times where you're like, well, he did do these terrible things, but like, why? You know what I mean? When you get into the why is when it gets very interesting. Um, but the third campaign, like I said, I took a little bit of a few pages out of Jared's book, and I went into all the media that I love within high fantasy, within like any Magic the Gathering, Dungeons and Dragons, fucking like Harry Potter, like all this other like stuff. So essentially, this is, I believe it's 3,000 years from if year zero. I believe I made year zero the slaying of Jublex from the original world when it was Pangea. That point in time is year zero. So 2,000, 3,000 years into the future, something like that, is where this world is currently set in. And it's essentially looks. There's three land masses. There's a smaller one in the center that is kind of like encompassed and covered. You can't really see it from the other two, but there's this giant maelstrom, like ever like ongoing. So think of like the storm
Okay,
on
Azeroth.
Jupiter. Yeah. So yeah, it's yes, it's essentially that, right? The World of Warcraft influence is definitely there. That's hilarious. I actually didn't realize that my map, because I drew my map on Incarnate. By the way, check out Incarnate if you like making maps. Shit's
Oh
dope.
yeah, I have a
Um,
map of Valune on Incarnate, but yeah, you said
that's
that my brain was
hilarious.
like
I didn't even
Azeroth.
I didn't even like, because if you, I'll show you the map later. It actually kind of looks like it. It's fucking hilarious. That's so funny. Sorry, I can't get over it. I unconsciously did the thing. Anyways, so yeah, so essentially, and on each continent there is a school. And what brought apart this idea is the Strixhaven book had come out, which is relatively recent. I believe it's like a year ago, maybe less than that. The Strixhaven setting came out. I believe it's a module.
That's from
Might be a
Magic,
module.
right? Strixhaven.
Yeah, but it is
Okay.
an actual D&D setting as well. It got its own book.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think I have the book on D&D Beyond.
Yeah. So I looked at that and I loved Hot Take apparently, because people don't like Strixhaven as a module because it like leaves a lot up to the imagination. But I love that. I love that specifically because I saw it and I saw its potential, and I was like, dude, I could build things around this. And like, what possibly could have happened throughout the world that you would need such a large institution to teach people of magic? Like, oh, and what happens to the people who are not magically inclined? What happens to those people who are not, who don't care or fear it, or let's say live close enough even to work in this situation? So essentially, what I did. Oh, sorry, real quick, another small sidebar. The reason why I ran this third campaign, and I'm running it the way I am, is one of the things I've run into over the years is people switching characters a lot, and not feeling a like connection, and not feeling necessarily comfortable enough to roleplay, and it's something that I've found hard to tackle. So this time around, I decided to try something that I've been mulling around for a couple of years, and essentially it's a series of one shots. So the main campaign itself starts. It's going to start. We haven't even started the main campaign yet. That's the hilarious part. It's going to start at level 10. And essentially what the idea is there's two schools. One is martial school that I named after the black magic practicing from school from Harry Potter, Durmstrang, and Strixhaven, which is obviously the magically inclined school. And they're on two separate continents on the opposite side of the world from each other. And there's these almost like ley lines throughout the world that culminates into these fountains of magic, and it's just pure raw arcane energy that just taint everything around them.
You gave me horrible flashbacks of having to run the Nightborn Suramar quest line. Ley lines. I was like, no. Oh no. The like 15 hours I spent on that.
Those class quests are hard. They're ridiculously overtuned. But yeah,
fun fact,
so
I don't know if you knew that. I've done all the allied race quests because I just felt like it.
I haven't done the alliance one. I haven't done the alliance ones yet. Those are like because I don't have. Oh,
you're right. I forgot
have the achievements. I'm
you're right. You're not. Yeah, kind of cringe. I don't know. I don't have any alliance. I don't have any alliance. No pun intended. Any specific way. They both have good points. Both sides. Good people on both sides.
Yeah, I mean, like burning the tree is kind of rough, but we could have an entire episode on this topic because I will take you to school, my guy.
WoW lore I'm interested in. I'm an elementary WoW lore nerd, not too advanced yet.
There's so much. It's so expensive. But yeah, so getting a little bit back on. So essentially, there's two schools. There's like ley lines that culminate into these different fountains of magic throughout both continents, and in the middle of the ocean, as well. And these fountains of magic, like they have positive things that they do, and there's negative things that they do. And there's two large fountains of magic, on both continents. The biggest ones. They're strewn throughout. So the one that Durmstrang is on is very, it's very settlement based. It's like it's forest and jungle, and the forest itself is imbued with the magic, so it changes constantly and it's ever shifting. It's almost like the labyrinths and myths that are like it's different right now that I woke up than it was when I went to bed, and now I don't know where I am, and it feels like I moved but I didn't. And it's this there's creatures that it's a really cool, it's really fun. And there's like creatures that have different, like there's like depending on the time of day and the time of year, there's certain types of bears and like werebears, and now it's like the summer. Now the bears itself look like they're dying and they're decomposing as they're walking around and trying to eat you. And so the magic itself is both negative and positive and has these ramifications. And Durmstrang is essentially formed because of this need to protect people. And Durmstrang was created on the largest fountain of magic. And so it's this large floating fortress of a castle that was built with the help of Strixhaven, because Strixhaven was established a few years prior. Probably like a decade prior. And it sits atop the biggest fountain of magic, and because it's the biggest one, usually a lot of stuff happens, a lot of stuff gets corrupted and changed, and they teach people basically how to defend themselves and defend those around them. And then as they graduate, they learn different things, and they go throughout the world, and they basically protect the world, save the world, and there's heroes that teach them and everything like that. And that's essentially the idea of Durmstrang. But because of the Fountain of Magic and the fact that they fight it every day, and for them it's never ending, they don't hate magic and magic users, because there are some that do choose to go to Durmstrang when they're magic users itself, whether it's I have to be physically capable of taking care of myself or whatever, or their class choices, whatever it may be. It's almost a distrust of it, because they've seen what raw, uncontrolled magic can do. They distrust anyone who so loosely uses it with no regard for those around them. And then there's Strixhaven, where it's like high school. Everyone's running around. They're casting spells at each other. They're like chasing each other down the hallways and the library. Everything in there is magical. There's like small little like mana wisps that, like, if you tell them to get you a book, they'll fly up to like the 33,000th row of books and bring you down the book, and they'll like throw it at you. And it's this whimsical, happy, super nonchalant, less militaristic than Durmstrang is, school where they teach you things. And again, there's another Fountain of Magic, and they are also built on it, but they have found a way to basically imbue the buildings in a way that it soaks up the Fountain of Magic itself. It soaks up the fountain, and it makes the buildings themselves like resistant to certain magics, which is useful when you have people practicing certain magics, right? You have people like...
So like a Demacian Petricite kind of deal?
Yeah, it's essentially, yeah. It makes it safer, essentially, because like you have like students like, oh, I just learned Fireball, I'm going to throw it at this building. The building's not going to catch on fire because it's imbued with this magic,
so it like disperses magic that's cast in or around it.
Yeah, essentially, yeah. So it's like people can still get hurt within it, obviously, because it doesn't protect them, but the buildings themselves and the structures are very safe, which makes it kind of like a fortress of solitude on the other continent. But the other continent is completely different. It's settled. There's cities. There's actually a Piltover-like city where it's the different like levels, and you have like the underground levels where like the criminals and the Zentarum, which is a D&D a group that I've kind of made into our like mafiosos. Essentially, there's this group who live underground, and they like go around. They just do like mafia things. They extort people and they do things for profit and whatnot. It's cool. But there's like a mini Vegas, and there's so on and so forth. So they so that's both schools essentially. And so essentially how it works is there's one shots for both schools. I call them one shots, but they're like multi-part adventures. They start at level 1 and they play until they're level 10. And it's relatively sped up. And then once they're level 10, there's this inter-school tournament that happens essentially. So like the best people from each graduating class kind of fight in this battle royale, and they get put into teams randomly. Oh, I wonder what's gonna happen. The party's gonna get put together, and whoever wins a prize. Yeah, the renown, the so on and so forth. So it's kind of like I don't know if you've seen My Hero Academia.
I was gonna say it's like MHA because that can inspire apparently a lot of D&D worlds.
Yeah, so it's like a My Hero Academia kind of like Hunger Games kind of situation. Only obviously it's not to the death, and the idea is like once they win and everything, they'll earn their level 10, they'll get their prize, and then as they're celebrating, some things will happen because they haven't quite gotten there yet. They got through the Strixhaven portion. They're towards the tail end of the Durmstrang portion, but they kind of end up taking a trip into the Maelstrom itself and discovering that it's not just a endless storm, that there may be more within it, maybe even another world and so on.
I don't know no.
Yeah.
Hate it when that happens.
Yeah. But essentially, in the how I explained the continents kind of splitting up was the Sundering. So I called it the Sundering, and it was like this magical explosion of sorts from a underground civilization that has now since disappeared from existence, that essentially teleported themselves away for an unknown reason at this point, and essentially created this gaping hole underground right below a fountain of magic that was like on the ocean floor. So essentially what happened is that fountain of magic coupled with the magic from the teleportation was like a recipe for disaster, an uncalculated mistake by this ancient civilization that caused this giant erupting, never-ending storm to kind of coalesce in between these continents, and that's the Great Sundering. Because essentially, what happened then is it just broke the Pangea up. It just shattered it and spreaded the continents throughout. So it's a little long-winded. Took a little longer than I had hoped, but that's essentially um, like that world. That final one encompasses all of them and the history of them and their characters and such.
Yeah, I really like that idea of connected worlds, and like there it's always really hard for anybody to put down, a world that they've built up and, worked in, and it's also really convenient for DMs to go with a world that they already have made and already know, because you can, make tweaks, you can make edits to small portions, small things, and you can, just have things change up. And it's always nice because it's really hard to encompass an entire world in one campaign. But if you want to explore, the world as a whole, it's usually going to take multiple campaigns. Like um, the campaign that I did, pretty much it went from D&D's Sword Coast, which is in this world now called the Argent Coast, because I love the name Argent. It's just a cool word. And so the Argent coastline, and then it went inland to this custom continent called called Alanthier. um, Alanthier takes a lot of inspiration from Magic the Gathering's color wheel, where there's
Mm-hmm.
five different city states that all have, what kind of correspond to the color identities. Where you have Frost Mountain, which their whole thing is, the whole place is just snow. It's think the Freljord, think Hoth, think whatever snow world you are familiar with. That is Frost Mountain times 10.
Mm-hmm.
um, and then there's Korash, which is in the Korashi Desert. Very, Egyptian inspired, very sort of um, very inspired by, a lot of Middle Eastern, you know, identities, and the whole of that city, instead of being built, upwards, it's built downwards into a massive hole in the ground, where everything's are dug out into the walls. And if they do want to build something that can't be dug into a wall, they pretty much dig their own canyon, because it gets so hot out in the desert that they couldn't, possibly build above ground unless they want like the metal to melt. And so, yeah, it's just a ridiculously hot place. Then there's Blackmore, which is kind of your basic scumlord town, where, well, not town, city, where it's tries to be, as noble and prosperous as it can, but it's rife with thievery and uh, just intrigue and assassination. And, it's pretty much the place that if you want to be a rogue, you go here. And then there's Del Renis, which is a just a lush, massive forest, where all of the buildings, all the cities are built up between boardwalks through the trees, and everything is built in flow and in harmony with nature instead of against it. And they'll think kind of Valen would, from the Elder Scrolls. The people won't touch the trees, for destruction. They'll import wood, or they'll shape the wood instead of, they'll never harm the tree. They might reshape part of it to, help them, but it's not they're not going to defy nature.
Mm-hmm.
um, and then there's, between Blackmore and Del Renis, there is there's Bogar, which is a place that's lost a lot of wars lately. Well, in the past, few decades, millennia. And they had such a small portion of territory left on Alanthier. They pretty much just own like the southern shoreline, and so they said, "Screw it, we're going to build underwater." And so this collection of mages and academics, they started building this like collection of tubes and all sorts of things, and they created this underwater utopia that can be accessed from the shore, but it's also incredibly easy to defend, because they got sick and tired of their neighbors teaming up and slapping them. And so they built most of this. The underwater city called Deep Ma is built entirely underwater, and it's a place where mages and academics go to seclude themselves and get away from it all, because they just don't want to deal with all the constant squabbling up above. And then in the center is a place called Lord's Rest, where it was named after a great valiant hero who died in that, to found that town, to fight off the hordes of evil, to give people a new life. And Lord's Rest is sort of the economic and political center of all of these city states, and their whole thing is they're kind of the arbiters of interactions and trade. If there is a gate for every single city state to enter from, so that nobody can ever bar off access to arbitration for any arguments or disagreements. They all have to respect the rules of Lord's Rest within Lord's Rest borders, no matter what city state they come from. Their whole thing is contracts and laws and this. But hearing all these descriptions, you can kind of hear Frost Mountain white, Korosh red, Blackmore black, Bogar blue, and Delrenis green. They kind of have that sort of color wheel esque identity with them. But they've really grown on both me and players, and they've taken on these identities. And I've had people really like making characters originating from certain places, because there's kind of a place for every play style. You want to be a rogue, maybe you originated in Blackmore. Blackmore has one of the premier academies for spies and spy masters to train at, called Malin Vols, named after a famous dark elf assassin who worked for as a royal spy master for years. Big lore stuff. But um and or you're a druid from Delrenis, and you just want to, you love nature, and you want to get out from your secluded forest, though, to go out and see the world. Just, it kind of gives a lot of places for characters to start their character archetype. But going back to like the world, so it started in the Argent Coast, went out to Elanthier, came back to the Argent Coast, then went to 5 different established worlds. We went to our modern world. We went to Skyrim. We went to an alternate dimension of their current world. We then went to. Don't you always love it when you forget your own things about your own campaign? Oh yes,
Dude,
we actually went
time
to.
travel is rough.
We went to the so fun fact of the day. If you're familiar with Yu-Gi-Oh, the the cards, and like they all have established, like a lot of cards have established lore and worlds built around them. And I'm going to be perfectly honest, I just want an excuse to make Dingirsu the Orcus, I think it's Dingirsu the Orcus automaton or whatever, into a boss fight, because it looks like a D&D boss. Look it up if you want to see a picture of it. And yeah, so I had this whole thing through the World Chalice story arc for Yu-Gi-Oh. And it actually was worked really well with D&D, partially because the World Chalice story was obviously inspired by like D&D parties and whatnot. Um, and so, and then the last one they went back to was Maple Stories world, where and I actually kind of treated that as the first Kalpa ever, because of how insane the magic is, and how that world is so packed to the brim with just ridiculous levels of power and uh, just everything. I was like, yeah, if there was a place where if there was a game world where I would say magic is strongest, it's probably here, where
Yeah,
everything could
definitely.
be considered a mage. Your thieves are mages, your bowmen are mages. Everything is actually a mage if you squint your eyes hard
Yeah,
enough. And
magic is
so
bursting at the seams within that world for sure.
and so that was where we kind of had the biggest power spike. I took a concept from Maple Story, the arcane symbols, which are these things you get in game. You get them in late game areas. They give you a big boost to stats, and so DMs out there, you're probably going to be groaning with pain at this, but everyone who got an arcane symbol, they got a 50 plus 50 boost to any stat. Just it was either a plus 50 or a plus 100. No, it was a plus 100 boost to any stat of their choice. Yes, plus 100. And that would
Jesus
affect
Christ.
and it uncapped their modifiers. So we had our I think our bow I think one of our bowmen I think yeah, Ayasha I think ended up with like a plus 20 something to her modifier for dex after getting her arcane symbol. Our thief had like also had a like a plus something for dex. Um wizard, she ended up with like a plus 30 or something, 30 40 something modifier for her intelligence, like ridiculous stuff. And so like I like that though, that uncapping the over the top, like just infinitely more powerful than you should be in in the context of a world. And but I kind of figured, I was like, well, if they're going to be going to this world where the magic is highest, how are they going to keep up? Because they're just going to die. They're going to get their ass beat. um and so I was like, probably the arcane symbols. And so that was when we started going from having enemies with thousands of health to tens to even hundreds of thousands of health, because people were hitting in the thousands and tens of thousands of damage at that point. It was really fun. So yeah, um, that's kind of how the thing went. But that was like, but this can't be all there is to Valyun. Just two different continents and then some portals elsewhere. And so then I created Terrathil, which is a more or less the Elven one, as every fantasy world has quote unquote the Elven one. And then there's a large continent to the south that's so mysterious, even the DM doesn't know what it's called because he can't think of a name. And it's a kind of uninhabited, uncivilized, nobody knows what's down there, and most ships that set sail for it don't return. So most people are like, you know what? Let's leave well enough alone. And they just ignore it. And so I'm eventually going to have something cool come out of there. And then in the northwestern kind of hemisphere, a um, there's a continent called Astraea that was a pretty standard medieval fantasy kingdom. um and it's I was like, you know what, this place is going to be the progenitor, well, not the progenitor, but the home and the headquarters of the organization that rose out of the end of the world, that the ones that believe that the world should have been destroyed, this organization called Dark Phoenix. The idea of the phoenix rising from the ashes. Their Dark Phoenix is essentially, why did the phoenix rise from the ashes? Why didn't we smother the ashes? And so they are, and they were looking for a place that was out of the way enough that they could grow, uncontested by these extremely powerful heroes, that are, because if they found out about them, they'd just waltz in there and be like, all right, everybody out, everybody's done, we're not doing this anymore. And so they use their influence and their knowledge of these other worlds opening to influence the Astraea, and just ask for, you know, slight bits of power and say in their governance and whatnot, for these vast gifts of wealth and all kinds of riches and goods from other worlds. And they'd introduce beautiful technology and all these crazy things that they've really just yoinked from other places, but they're selling it as, oh, this is the power we could offer your kingdom. And more sooner or later, as always happens when somebody offers to do a nice thing for you, if you're in a fantasy game, Dark Phoenix said, you know what, we're in charge now. And the king was like, you can't do that. And he was like, nope, we're in charge now. Bye, king. And so he got ousted, and they took over the entire continent, and they pretty much just use that place as their headquarters. That is where their big central focus is. That's where they have most of their outposts, their facilities. They, as I mentioned earlier, part of this high magic world is that kids are being born with these traits. Essentially, think My Hero Academia. Once again, great for world building. Think quirks. That they're born with these magical abilities that can range from relatively mundane to insanely overpowered, and their Dark Phoenix is looking to more or less make soldiers out of all these kids that they're taking in, and so pretty much if they get any whiff of a kid being born with any kind of power or ability, they'll go and they'll find them, they'll take them away, they'll test them, and if they if the kid's really young and won't remember anything, they'll return him to the family. If the kid is old enough to remember what happened, then they will keep the kids for labor or whatever they want to do, because Dark Phoenix are kind of assholes. um, and so it's made for this a pretty relatively compelling villain, at least for everybody I introduced it to, because apparently kidnapping kids and child soldiers are not cool with a lot of people, so that's good. So yeah, they're down to fight them at any opportunity they can get. And they're this organization, in my mind, they've just kind of expanded and been constantly growing and what their end goal is. And spoiler alert, if you ever play in any one of my D&D campaigns, was like, what's something cool that they could be doing that would both require their numbers and their technological access, as well as like their magical access, to be able to pull off. And it's like, what about a Dyson sphere? So if you're unfamiliar, do you know what a Dyson sphere is, Rolando?
It does not ring a bell.
So Dyson spheres are kind of a sci-fi concept, but it's essentially this idea of building a power plant or a facility around a star and harnessing the power of that star as energy for whatever you want this facility to do. And they want to erase the world. What better thing than to harness the entire power of a star? And so that's kind of their end goal, which is going to be a big thing, because this is still high fantasy. Most people are running around, if they're not running around with spells, they're running around with bows and swords. How are we going to fight space wizards? What is this? And so it kind of creates this power dynamic, because I was like, where do you go from heroes that have already saved the world from destruction? I was like, what about where do you go from the stakes? How do you raise the stakes here? I was like, well, what about people achieving the same thing, but they have way more numbers? And so that's kind of been the whole basis of this next leg of the campaign. And this whole thing is being spearheaded by the kids of the heroes that saved the world, because it's been about 15-20 years. So most of these kids are late teens, early 20s. And they had a lot, and I mean a lot. And so but across the party, and they ended up and so they ended up really quick early on realizing that Dark Phoenix had created a technology called light killers, which are these bullets that can essentially corrupt the body, the soul, and the spirit, and turn good people horrifically bad, and turn bad people worse, I guess. But the light killers make for a really good balancing thing for me as a DM, because we know that there's heroes out there in the world that could very likely just storm their way into Dark Phoenix's facilities, kick in the door, and mow everything down from the daisies on upwards. But because of these light killers, if one of them gets corrupted, it it's going to take a lot of people to take them down, because if they're fighting with no restraint and no mental inhibition, with nothing but just the skills that they have, yeah, it's going to be a problem. A level 50 having running around, and if there's no other level 50s nearby, well, good luck. Hope you didn't want to keep that little town anyways.
That's a super interesting concept. I love the idea of having heroes still exist within your world, and that's something that still exists within my world. There's some characters, like there's a good friend of mine out here. His name's Cody. His very first D&D character ever, which was in a different campaign that I was a player in, his name was Coop. Lo and behold, Cooper is his last name. But the guy's name was Coop. And he's like just this dwarf pugilist fighter monk thing that just ran around didn't care about anything, just wanted to kick somebody's ass. That was like, it's his entire personality. But he is alive in this world. And he's a teacher at Durmstrang, and so he's like this epic level hero. He's only level 20 because, like you said, it's hard to balance anything above that. So
I have
level,
no qualms about that.
yeah. So he's level 20, but there's been one time where it was scripted to happen as such. There's essentially like when they were trying to arrive at Durmstrang, like they're getting overwhelmed by what essentially was endless numbers of corrupted like wolves from the forest, and they were trying to get into Durmstrang, and he kind of comes down and he essentially holds them all off long enough to the point where they're like get back up to the school, and then he like leaves. But it's this really cool concept of having those characters exist there, and like having them see that, like it's so sick. To see that like callback, and especially when you like role play what their character would do properly. I don't know. It's a cool concept, but I also it's hard, right? Because then you go into that same, like, what's stopping them from saving everything? What's stopping them from, oh, there's this guy who's trying to take over the world. Why aren't they doing anything about it? Why don't we just go get him? And so like you wind up having to do certain things. Like there's only a few of the teachers who are like epic level. Most of them are like intellectuals. There's Coop, and then there's my favorite character I've ever made. My favorite NPC ever. His name's Boz. He's he's the dean of Strixhaven. He's a Luxodon barbarian, and he's the dean of the magic school.
Bro,
and he's the leader of what is called the Red Dawn. I love Luxodons; they're so cool. But he's the dean of the magic school as a barbarian, and he has like essentially what would be like tattoos from Tasha's, but they're like on his tusks, so they look like they're engraved into his tusks. And they're items essentially. They're like item uses, and that's where he gets his like magic from. But he's like the leader of what's called the Red Dawn. The Red Dawn. He's the only him and Coop are the only surviving members of the Red Dawn. Because there was like this catastrophic, basically, there's this event. The fountains of magic were pouring out these, opened the portal to like the abyssal plane, and hordes and hordes of demons were just pouring out of it, and the entire world basically had to come together in order to fight them off at this portal, and they were running out of people. And essentially, what happened is, Boz and the Red Dawn were the ones making the last stand, and the leader of the Red Dawn at that point was her name was Tasha, not Tasha, but like her name is just Tasha.
Why does every fantasy world have to have a Tasha? We have a Tasha as well, Queen of Blackmore.
It's a cool name. It's a cool name, man. I don't know. It's short. It's simple. It demands authority. It's weird. But yeah. So like, she like looks at Boz and she's like, "Go get reinforcements. We're not gonna last very long here. We can last as long as it'll take you to get back, because he's the fastest. You know, the Luxodon barbarian. Go fucking figure." So he takes off and he goes reluctantly, of course, because leader told him to go do it. So he's gonna go get reinforcements, and he comes back, finds the portal closed, and her weapon, and then the weapons of the three other like lieutenants essentially of the Red Dawn, and the portal's closed, and there. And essentially what had happened is, she at that point in time was a grave cleric. Grave clerics hate the undead, right? So keep that in mind. So she realizes they're gonna fail before he's able to get back with help. So she's like, "All right, cool. Everybody step into the portal," and everyone's like, "All right, cool. Yes, ma'am." So they all step into the portal, and she stands there, and the portal is slowly starting to close. She divine interventioned essentially to have the portal close, start to close, but it's not something that happens instantaneously, obviously, because suspense. And as it's closing, she looks at everybody and she says, "We're the last stand. We have to be here until this portal closes. whether we die or not. And she kind of says it in a way where everybody has high enough insight where they understand what's going to
We're
happen here.
fucking dead.
But still, they stand there and they have this epic battle. I actually have it all scripted. Maybe at some point I'll read it off. They have this epic battle, and they fight back the demons and such. And as everybody's dying and she's the last one, she makes that decision essentially to sever her ties to her ideals to save the world one last time. And she starts casting reanimation spells and making zombie versions of her friends and endlessly bringing them back up in order to hold back these endless hordes of demons and terrible things. And the last thing she tries to do is send a message to her then husband, who is through the portal, right? And the spell doesn't take. So, like, her magic, she was a cleric. Her magic was, like, taken away because of this thing that she did. So, like, it was, like, the ultimate sacrifice kind of situation. And, like, that's how I dealt with having heroes in the world that could have done a thing, essentially. Like, it's like this... Boz's whole thing and Coop's whole thing is, like, I failed last time. Maybe I shouldn't get involved. You know, like that kind of like apprehension,
regret,
PTSD type of and it's a really interesting angle.
Yeah, I do like you know, there's this weird, you know, trend that I for some reason love as a DM, and you know my wife really likes, is the idea of exploring, you know, the real mental health implications of things that would happen while adventuring and how people would respond to events while adventuring. There's, you know, kind of that idea of you know, the game Darkest Dungeon, where it was, you know,
Mm-hmm.
revolutionary because you're not just a bunch of gruff brave heroes who you know, march into the dungeon, get their loot, have a good time, and leave. You know, fighting off hordes of terrifying monsters and almost pitch blackness is gonna weigh on your mind, and it's gonna
100%.
start to fuck with your head. And so I really enjoy that sort of, you know, exploring, you know, that character psyches and how characters would you know, would really react. Just because you're powerful doesn't mean you're immune to, you know, your the effects that, you know, the seeing and experiencing horrible things can have on you. And so I really liked that about, you know, Chris's character John, is that, you know, as she played him as he was mentally deteriorating throughout the campaign because he was just more and more pain and suffering, and he didn't know, you know, when this was going to end, because it felt like there was so much they had to do to save the world, and he was starting to ask, you know, is it even worth saving the world at this point? Like and you know, that's a pretty bad place to get to, is should we really even bother? Like it's too exhausting. I'm not going to want to live even if the world continues to exist. So just, I don't know. I do like that idea though of, you know, using a character's past trauma and their past experiences as a inhibitor. That just because they can, you know, go wild doesn't mean that they're going to. And yeah, that I think that, you know, for the most part, because there were so many different, you know, heroes spread across this world, it was that would have been kind of a hard thing, you know, to apply to all of them. John
Definitely.
specifically, John Lightstrider, his whole thing was that he took up the mantle of Rao, which in D&D is the god of peace, because ever since the beginning of the campaign, he was the pacifist, non-violent type who really just wanted to search for peaceful resolutions to anyone who was willing to take it. Uh, Carissa, or wife, she took the chef perk, the chef feat, and just did everything she could to, you know, make him an excellent cook. You know, looked into like what stats it would take, what roles it would take. I was like, you know what, John is a great cook. I will 100% give you that. Didn't think it was going to be useful, and there was a non-zero amount of fights that were circumvented by John's cooking. And so it became a half meme, half, character trait of John, that he's an exceptional cook and he's just so good at it. And uh I don't know, just made for a really fun sort of like addition, a more interesting part of to a character. Like, yo, you can shoot a bow good. Okay, well, every adventurer can do that, but the cooking, that's the real good
Mm-hmm.
stuff.
Right.
But yeah, I do like that idea of, you have to sometimes inhibit, if you want to have those recurring characters, you have to find a way to inhibit their presence in the story. And so, like I said, these corrupting bullets, um is it going to be harder to stop one of these, level 1 kids if they get hit by a light killer, or a level 50 barbarian with 4,000 health? Like, who's going to be more of a problem? um we've like, there's a lot of the characters would have, their one hard counter, that level 50 barbarian, his wife, who he like basically simps for, is like the one and only thing that could possibly snap him out of it. But yeah, it still makes for a really good, like, sometimes, I will, allow these old heroes, these old characters to come out of not retirement. They're not necessarily super old, especially with, godhood, preserving age and whatnot. But they will, hop on out and let the world know that they're not gone, they're not going anywhere, and that they can still kick ass. Where, there's a bunch of people, threatening their kids, or some Dark Phoenix agents think that they can get away with a quick kidnapping, and then an arrow strikes one of them, and then another one, and then they start finding themselves just blanketed in arrows, as they're, pinned down from all sides by one person somehow. So that sort of idea. But for the most part, they're being cautious with that idea of, if we get hit, it's gonna, for every one of us that gets hit, it's gonna take four of us to take us down. So if there was like 12 heroes, by the time that four of us have been hit by those bullets, it's game over for the world. So that's not good.
Yeah.
Um,
Right.
yeah. So this is a lot of stuff, a lot of concepts. We could probably talk about this for a couple hours, if not
Oh,
longer.
definitely. I
Um,
could talk about this all day.
yeah, we'll probably have a few episodes that come back to this. But really, just to wrap things up, there's a lot that goes into this world building, and how we DM certain things, and it's really interesting, especially hearing your perspectives, hearing the worlds that you've made. Like, it's really enlightening to kind of hear how other people do it, because a lot of times, I'm sure everyone here's listened to D&D horror stories,
Mm-hmm.
and heard of those things, of the DM that railroads their world, or railroads the group, or it forces this, or they introduce super OP DMPCs. If you are not familiar with the term DMPC, it's a dungeon master player character, where they essentially want to be playing the game while also DMing for it. And they usually, show up in the form of this massively overpowered, level 20 multi-classed, min-maxed, best gear, best in slot gear, like, sort of character, who, and then all the parties supposed to, gather around and, admire how cool your character is, instead of, make the story about the party. um and so, uh, I really like the, this kind of idea of, legacies, and how the character, a lot of D&D's world building is you setting up the setting and making the world and the planet and, the continents. But really, a lot of the world building, and like how the societies and the people interact, comes from the characters who have interacted with that world previously. And I liked your Strixhaven example of how a lot of D&D modules are not just strict, this is how you play this exact module, here is who
Mm-hmm.
shows up at this exact time, you have to use this to do this exact thing. um it's they can be back These modules can be as little as like backdrops, where if you need to know something about a specific city you want to visit, sure, go for it. One of my, follow up, I called them like mini one shots because they weren't necessarily, one session one shots, but they were much quicker paced than, full campaigns. Carissa was playing as one of the first people to have a kid abducted by Dark Phoenix, and she was a young single mother who was desperately fighting with every fiber of her being to to get her kid back, and she ended up getting her kid back. And she was also a fervent follower of Bahal, which was made for some very funny interactions because Bahal is a uh, short little assassin girl, even though everybody expects Bahal to be this big murder demon god. Just this little tiny assassin girl who is the embodiment of murder. And so she was, blessed by Bahal to be able to, to be able to pretty much finish out her mission. And we used the a little bit of the water deep dragon heist module, and then um, what's it called, the Icewind Dale, I think, the cold 10 towns place, that
Mm-hmm.
module.
Ice window.
And that was where the facility that her kid was being held was in this Icewind Dale. Was up in Icewind Dale, right outside of 10 towns. They built a facility into the mountain because who's gonna venture out into the freezing cold to go look for kidnapped kids? Nobody. And so it was the perfect place. It was a great setting. And that we used the module, but it just as a backdrop, just to get an idea of the place, but not to follow the story. The Everything given to you in D&D, from the official modules, like hot take, everything you see from the Dungeon Master's Guide to the Player's Handbook to every adventure and adventure module is a guidebook. It's called the Dungeon Master's Guide, not the Dungeon Master's Law. uh, Everything is made to enhance what you want to do or what your mind is. There's no shame in ripping off other ideas from other franchises, media, whatever. There's nothing wrong with homebrewing. There's nothing wrong with playing D&D in a way that's fun for you and your players, because that's ultimately the
Yeah, that's the goal.
audience. Yeah, that's the goal, is fun. If
The
you
goal is to have fun. Yeah.
Yeah, if the audience is, if the players are miserable, or the DM is miserable but the players are having fun or some fun, and usually if the DM's miserable, the players aren't having fun. I can vouch for this now. um, and if either group is miserable, nobody will end up having fun. The DM will feel like their world's falling flat. The players will feel like the DM doesn't want them to do anything cool. But if you take these settings and just morph them in a way to suit your table and suit the people that you're playing for as well as yourself, it will ultimately lead to a infinitely more fun experience. And yeah, that's really all I have to say about that. Is don't don't be a rules lawyer about the D&D books.
But yeah, and
Is
then
there
like
anything you
what
want
it
to
comes
add to
into
that?
is no, that's basically that's it. Like we come from two totally different like schools of thought in D&D, and most of the time like when it comes to like online discussion about these two differing styles, because you're very the literally do whatever you want and go up to level 50, do this, do that, do the other thing, homebrew everything out the wazoo. And I don't see a problem with that, and I don't understand why there's an issue. Well, I mean, I do understand why that people have an issue with it. I understand where people are coming from. It's like some people
Things
do
get
not have
broken
fun, but
quickly. Yeah.
well, some people don't have fun when you can do whatever you want, right? There's a point where it
Mm.
becomes monotonous, but if your group is having fun, then it's fine. That's the biggest thing. Is like I definitely prefer being a little bit closer to the heart of D&D. I don't play D&D like vanilla. Definitely don't. Anytime any player wants to use a specific weapon, do this, do that, do the other thing, or has a concept they want to live out. Like I've made probably 12 feats for this most recent world. I've made magic items. I've designed tattoo ideas that are function as magic items. I homebrew my fair share, but definitely not as much as you do. And like it just comes down to what people enjoy. And like if whatever it is that you're asking for is gonna have you have more fun, like why wouldn't I? Like I could literally you can't do whatever you want. I can tell you no whenever I feel like it. But I can do whatever I want. Therefore, if I give you this thing, I could have a thing or a person or something or a concept that challenges that thing and makes you earn that thing and makes it so like not necessarily takes it away from you because that's not fun either, right? Why would I give it to you if I'm just gonna take it away? But like something to contend with, something to make you feel like, okay, so like I earned this thing, I earned this ability to do this thing, I trained for it, or I made a deal with somebody and I outsmarted them, so this is what I ended up with, like so on and so forth. So like I could literally write in whatever I want. So I don't see the problem in trying to follow things to a T.
Mhm. Yeah,
But yeah, I mean, yeah. No, go ahead.
sorry. One of the things that Rolando actually told me a few months ago. Yes, you, Rolando. That's also really influenced my world. Is I still was kind of constrained on some things. I was like, well, there's going to be some laws and this and that. And Rolando said the most impactful thing that I've ever heard that really kind of cemented my view on this over the top bombastic D&D style that I have, and that is the wish spell exists. So even in vanilla D&D, there's the wish spell, which is essentially if you think it and the DM approves of it, it can happen. And
Yep.
I kind of was like, you know what? You're right, because the whole thing, if I remember correctly, was my wife. She was playing as a character that was in a lesbian relationship, and they really wanted to have a baby. And it was like, well, what if they just wish spelled it? And I was like, I don't know if that would. She was like, the wish spell exists. I was like, shoot, you're right. And so
Yep.
I was like, yeah,
I
would
remember
it be
that.
physically possible? No, the wish spell exists though.
Yep.
So, thank you, Rolando. You made Chris's day, and you made the campaign ultimately more enjoyable for both of us. So,
Hey man, it's one of those things where it's almost relieving once you get past that point where you're like, well, this doesn't make sense, and once you like kind of get over it and or even like make a reason for it to make sense in your world. Like it's not
mhm,
even like necessarily getting over the concept. It's like, well, in my world it works because of A, B, and C. It's almost like liberating. You don't
mhm,
spend so much time worrying about logistically. Even in world building, you're not like, oh well, like orcs are evil, so like this person wants to play an orc, and so people are gonna hate them, and that's such a
mhm,
closed-minded way to think. You know what I mean? Like, and it puts you in this weird bottleneck where somehow this character who has not met the party yet has to redeem themselves to the party, and like that's
mhm.
not fair to them. They haven't done anything wrong, right? So like it's this whole yeah, from like a world
Yeah.
building standpoint, being able to liberate yourself not only doesn't just liberate yourself, it liberates your world and makes it more friendly to explore, and also it
More
liberates your
dynamic.
players in order to make certain.
Mhm.
It makes you dynamic. Yeah, yeah.
It makes it dynamic. It makes it so that there's nothing you can expect anymore, and that's actually I think a really good way to like like I said it in a video I recently made. I'm definitely gonna plug my YouTube channel here at the end. But a video I made about Maple Story is that the world building and the setting is so just weird. There's so much weirdness in it that once you get to that certain point of weirdness, any extra weirdness is just like, yeah, the setting is weird, so weirdness belongs in the setting. And I
Yeah.
really like that idea of taking something if it's just so out there to start with, then adding more out there is just what's a what's one extra mile to 100 miles versus one extra mile to an inch. And
Right.
so it was a quote. I forgot where I heard this quote, and I really hate that I forgot where I saw it, but it was something along the lines of, I maybe it was in a video about world building or something, but it was when your creator is creating a world or anything, they the audience will afford them one large leap in credibility and then expect perfect consistency from there on out. And so like Star Wars says space wizards that fly spaceships all across the place to fight robots. Okay, that makes sense. And also maybe Greedo tried to shoot Han before Han tried to shoot Greedo. What did you do? You've ruined Star Wars. So it's that idea of we're like, yeah, we'll accept anything you tell us initially, but past that initial thing you've told us, we expect it to be consistent. We expect everything else that could happen after what you initially told us is it has to make sense in what you've initially told us.
100%.
And so
100%.
that's where that whole idea of like when Chris was just like, oh, I really want this couple to have a baby, and I was like, the world's once I heard the wish spell exists, it's like the world's weird enough. We have level 50s that went to the Maple Story universe to fight the Black Mage and then fight one of the observers that's like a god of time that exists outside of their dimension by punching it in the face and doing a septon sexagentillion damage to kill it. But a lesbian couple couldn't have a baby? Really? Is that the stretch too far? So
Straight up.
that was kind of the thing that got me to like,
I'm proud that you made that. I'm proud of you, because if even if you like ignore the wish spell, it's like, well, like some of them are gods, right? So they can like do things. Like you just be like, oh, okay, yeah, here's a baby. Like, you know what I mean? Just materialize a baby out of fucking nowhere, like it.
Yeah, you could have just talked to a god of life, and he would be like, yeah, sure, I'll put a baby in one of you who wants it. It's like it's not.
Who wants to carry it?
Yeah, who wants to carry it? It's not that hard. And like, and so I think that's kind of the ultimate goal is that liberation. I like that word of your world and your perspective as a DM to be able to accept what makes your players happy, because ultimately, 9 times out of 10, if your players are happy, you as a DM will probably end up having more fun and be excited to DM for sessions instead of everybody knows DM dread when you're like, oh no, I have to DM a session tomorrow. Ugh. And you realize I have to do this and we have to do this and I'm gonna have to deal. Ooh, ow! Did you just like fall out of your chair?
It's fine. I'm alive.
Oh, okay, that's her. So yeah, you just feel, you can when you can feel your player's energy is that of excitement and investment into your world, it will pay off so much better than being like, well, I followed the rules and it all makes sense, but now no one's having fun.
100%.
And so,
100%.
Yeah, so that's really everything I have to say on the topic. Is there anything you want to say to wrap us up, or?
I think that's it. Like you said, we'll probably revisit this topic. There's a lot to unpack here, within our own worlds and how we do things and stuff like that. So, yeah, but yeah, I think that's about where we should leave it off for sure.
All right. Well, in that case, thank you very much, Rolando. We'll probably try to do these weekly, maybe bi-weekly. It'll really depend. We'll see how our schedules look and how reception is going with this first one. But yeah. So until next time, outro. Thank you for listening. If you're interested in hearing more from us, you can follow us on Twitter and YouTube at Punkling Podcast. If you're already listening on YouTube, please like and subscribe and let us know what other topics you want to hear about from us. Thank you all so much for listening, and we can't wait to see you come back next time.